The most dangerous illusion ever sold to humanity is the belief that power announces itself loudly. You have been taught to expect revolutions to arrive with drums, banners, and sudden collapse. But history does not turn on spectacle, it turns on consciousness. The most powerful revolutions begin without noise, without permission, and without applause. They begin the moment the oppressed understand the truth of their condition. Look around you. The world praises productivity, yet despises the producer. It celebrates wealth while hiding the hands that create it. You are told that this order is natural, inevitable, eternal. But what is presented as destiny is merely a system, constructed by men for men and against men. Capitalism does not rule by force alone, it rules by confusion. It teaches the worker to see wages as generosity, exploitation as opportunity, and survival as success. It divides labor from its product, the worker from their own humanity, and society into classes locked in unequal struggle. One class owns, another obeys. One accumulates, another exhausts. One lives from profit, another from necessity. This is not an accident. This is the logic of capital. Under this system, labor becomes a commodity, and the human being is reduced to an instrument. The worker produces value but owns none of it. The wealth of society grows, yet poverty deepens for those who create it. This contradiction is not a flaw, it is the engine. Capital feeds on unpaid labor, and inequality is its oxygen. But here lies the truth. The ruling class fears most. The worker is not weak. The worker is isolated. Alone, the laborer struggles. Together, the working class is an unstoppable force. The factories, the fields, the offices, the streets, all movement of society flows from labor. Without workers, capital is nothing but paper and illusion. The moment this is understood, power begins to shift. Revolution does not begin with violence, it begins with awareness. It begins when people stop blaming themselves for a system designed to fail them. It begins when the worker recognizes their exploitation not as personal misfortune, but as a shared condition. Consciousness is the first act of rebellion. The ruling class understands this. That is why they invest so heavily in distraction, division, and fear. They separate workers by nation, race, religion, and gender, not because these differences matter to power, but because unity terrifies it. A divided working class debates identity while capital quietly consolidates control. But history moves in one direction, toward contradiction, toward crisis, toward change. Every system that exploits its majority plants the seeds of its own destruction. When production becomes social but ownership remains private, conflict is inevitable. When workers produce collectively but live individually in insecurity, the system fractures. This is not ideology, it is material reality. Do not wait for collapse to act. Do not wait for permission to organize. Do not wait for leaders to save you. The revolution you are waiting for begins where you stand, in your workplace, your community, your solidarity with others who share your condition. True change is not spontaneous chaos, it is organized struggle. It is discipline, education, and unity. It is the transformation of anger into purpose and suffering into strategy. The working class must not only resist, it must envision a new social order where production serves human need, not private profit. A society where labor is not alienated, where wealth is shared by those who create it, where human dignity is not sacrificed for accumulation. This is not utopia, this is necessity. The most powerful revolutions do not announce themselves because they do not need to. They grow quietly in the minds of the oppressed, in the bonds of solidarity, in the refusal to accept exploitation as fate. When the moment comes, they do not ask for change, they impose it. Workers of the world, understand your power. Organize, unite, and claim what has always been yours. History is not written by the powerful, it is made by the conscious. Class consciousness is not a simple awareness of one's own suffering or exploitation, It is the profound realization of one's position within the structure of society, the recognition of the systemic inequalities that shape every aspect of life, and the understanding that personal struggles are inseparable from the struggles of others who occupy the same class. It is the awakening that the hardships endured by the individual worker, the long hours, the inadequate wages, the relentless toil, are not accidental misfortunes, nor are they the result of personal failure, but are inherent features of a system designed to benefit a few while subordinating the majority. The worker who develops class consciousness perceives the invisible chains of capitalism, the subtle ways in which labor is commodified, and how wealth accumulates not through merit but through the extraction of value from those who produce it. This awareness transcends the superficial narratives propagated by the ruling class, which seek to make exploitation appear normal, inevitable, and even desirable, by teaching the laborer to take pride in their poverty, to see their toil as a virtue while obscuring the mechanisms of inequality. Class consciousness is the lens through which the worker understands that the division between owner and laborer is not a natural order, but a historically constructed one, maintained by laws, ideology, and coercion to perpetuate the dominance of capital. It allows the worker to see that the struggles faced are not isolated incidents, but part of a broader pattern affecting millions, a pattern that repeats across industries, regions, and generations, revealing the systemic nature of oppression. Through this lens, wage labor is no longer a neutral exchange, but a relationship defined by power, where the worker produces far more value than is returned to them, and where the wealth generated flows upward to sustain a privileged class that lives off the labor of others. Class consciousness awakens the mind to the truth that these inequalities are maintained not by chance, but by design, and that they are reinforced through institutions, cultural norms, and even education, which collectively instill acceptance of a hierarchical society and discourage questioning of the status quo. It brings clarity to the mechanisms of ideology, showing how ideas are used to obscure economic realities, divide the working class, and prevent collective action. This consciousness is not merely intellectual, it is moral and practical. It involves recognizing that exploitation is not a personal misfortune to be endured quietly, but a social injustice to be challenged collectively. It transforms the worker from a passive participant in the system into an active agent capable of understanding and resisting the structures of oppression. It cultivates solidarity, as individuals who recognize their shared conditions begin to see themselves as part of a larger social body, bound together not by charity or sentiment, but by common interest. Class consciousness is also inherently historical. It situates the present within the context of past struggles, understanding that the conditions of labor have evolved, but that the underlying dynamics of exploitation have persisted. It is a recognition that every advance in workers' rights, every labor movement, and every social reform has been achieved not by the goodwill of the powerful, but through the organized struggle of those who refuse to accept subjugation. This historical awareness deepens resolve, providing a sense of continuity and purpose, showing that the collective power of the working class has the capacity to reshape society, to challenge entrenched structures of domination, and to establish more equitable systems. It also sharpens the critique of capitalism, revealing the contradictions inherent in a system where production is social but ownership is private, where labor produces value that is appropriated by capital, and where the conditions of life for the many are subordinated to the accumulation of wealth for the few. In this way, class consciousness is both analytical and mobilizing, enabling the worker to understand the economic, social, and political forces that govern life, while also inspiring action to alter those forces. It dissolves the illusions that prevent solidarity, exposing the ways in which the ruling class manipulates divisions among workers. by nationality, ethnicity, gender, or ideology to maintain control, and showing that unity is the path to collective empowerment. It transforms perception into strategy, as the realization of shared oppression leads to coordinated action, whether through labor unions, political movements, or community organizing. Class consciousness is the foundation of revolutionary thought because it clarifies both the problem and the potential solution. The problem is systemic exploitation, and the solution is organized collective struggle to reclaim control over the conditions of life, production, and society itself. Capitalism is not merely an economic system, it is a carefully constructed mechanism designed to extract wealth from the labor of the many while concentrating power in the hands of the few. At its core, it thrives on exploitation, a relentless process in which the laborer produces value far beyond what is returned in wages, yet receives little recognition or compensation for the surplus labor that sustains the profits of the capitalist. This exploitation is not incidental but systemic, embedded in the very structure of production and exchange, where the worker's time, energy, and creativity are transformed into commodities that generate profit for the owner of capital. The more the worker produces, the more the capitalist accumulates, yet the worker remains bound by the constraints of survival, compelled to sell their labor for a fraction of its real worth. In this system, human beings are reduced to instruments of production, their dignity subordinated to efficiency, and their needs rendered secondary to the imperatives of accumulation. Exploitation extends beyond the immediate relationship between worker and employer. It permeates society through unequal access to resources, education, healthcare, and opportunity, ensuring that the majority remains dependent, fragmented, and subordinate, while the few consolidate wealth and influence. Capitalism thrives on this inequality because it generates the very conditions for its continuation, creating a population of workers whose labor sustains the system while their divided circumstances prevent meaningful resistance. Division is as critical to capitalism as exploitation itself, for a fragmented workforce is easier to control, manipulate, and pacify. The ruling class achieves this division by fostering competition among workers, convincing them that their struggles are personal rather than collective, that scarcity is a natural condition and that they must compete with one another for survival within a rigged system. Workers are separated by nationality, race, religion, gender, and skill, encouraged to see differences as barriers rather than shared conditions, while the capitalists benefit from the lack of unity. Ideology plays a crucial role in sustaining these divisions, as the narratives of meritocracy, individualism, and personal responsibility obscure systemic injustice and persuade the oppressed that their position is the result of personal failure rather than structural exploitation. Education, media, and culture serve to reinforce these divisions, presenting the accumulation of wealth by the few as a sign of virtue, and the poverty of the many as an unfortunate but deserved consequence. Within this framework, labor unions, community organizations, and collective movements are often marginalized or co-opted, their potential for challenging the system weakened by internal disputes or external pressures, while the capitalist class continues to expand its influence through both economic and political channels. The division of labor itself is a form of exploitation, fragmenting the worker's skills and knowledge to increase efficiency and productivity, yet denying the worker control over the entirety of the production process and preventing the development of holistic understanding or empowerment. Workers become cogs in a machine, producing wealth they do not own, performing tasks dictated by others, and internalizing the constraints imposed upon them. Meanwhile, the capitalist class profits from innovation, mechanization, and technological advances without necessarily contributing to production itself, relying on the labor of the masses to generate value while enjoying the freedom of ownership. Exploitation and division are mutually reinforcing. As workers are exploited, they are also divided, and as they are divided, exploitation becomes more efficient. Capitalism must constantly manage this tension, balancing the extraction of labor with the pacification of discontent, ensuring that enough wages are paid to prevent revolt while withholding enough to sustain inequality. The system thrives on crisis, using economic instability to discipline the workforce, justify austerity, and consolidate power, while ideological tools reinterpret suffering as opportunity for personal improvement rather than a symptom of systemic failure. Even cultural and social institutions are shaped by these imperatives, teaching compliance, reinforcing hierarchies, and rewarding conformity, all while masking the extraction of wealth and power that occurs behind the scenes. In this way, capitalism is not only an economic order, but a comprehensive system of control that depends upon the subjugation and fragmentation of the majority. It succeeds because exploitation produces wealth for the few, and division prevents the many from uniting to challenge it. Every innovation, every market expansion, and every financial maneuver is predicated on maintaining this balance, ensuring that power remains concentrated while the workforce remains productive, yet powerless. Exploitation and division are the twin engines of capitalism, inseparable and mutually dependent, creating a society in which inequality is naturalized, resistance is marginalized, and the accumulation of wealth by a small elite is both protected and perpetuated, shaping the consciousness, behavior, and relationships of all who live within its reach and conditioning the very structure of human social life. Labor is the foundation of all wealth. Every object of value, every service that sustains society, every innovation and improvement is the product of human effort. The sweat of the brow, the skill of the hands, the ingenuity of the mind, all coalesce to create the material and immaterial wealth that structures human existence. Yet under capitalism, this fundamental truth is inverted. The laborer, who produces the very wealth that sustains society, owns little to none of what they create. The system is organized so that the fruits of labor are appropriated by those who own the means of production, the factories, the machines, the tools, the land, while the worker receives only a fraction of the value they generate in the form of wages, which are often barely sufficient to meet the demands of survival. The capitalist does not create value in the sense that the worker does. Their power derives entirely from ownership, from control over the instruments through which labor is expressed, and from the ability to claim as profit the surplus produced by the laborer. This separation of labor and ownership is the central mechanism through which inequality is reproduced. While the worker must continually toil to secure their own subsistence, the capitalist accumulates wealth simply by maintaining control over the process of production. Labor becomes a commodity, a resource to be bought and sold in the market, its value determined not by the needs of the producer, but by the demands of profit. The worker is thus compelled to exchange their labor power under terms dictated by the capitalist, and the value that exceeds the cost of wages, the surplus value, is expropriated as profit. It is this expropriation that allows wealth to concentrate in the hands of a few, while the many who produce it remain deprived of its benefits. The more the worker produces, the more the capitalist earns, yet the worker's standard of living is constrained by the need to compete with other laborers for employment and by the artificially suppressed wages that maximize capital accumulation. This dynamic is masked by ideological narratives that depict wages as fair compensation for effort, labor as a moral duty, and profit as a reward for initiative, obscuring the reality that it is the unpaid labor, the surplus created but not returned, that constitutes the true source of wealth. The laborer's deprivation is systemic, embedded in the very structure of the economy, and reinforced by legal, social, and political institutions that protect property rights and privilege capital over labor. Even as society becomes more productive and capable of generating abundance, the workers' share does not proportionally increase, for the system is designed to channel the majority of wealth toward ownership and to maintain the dependence of the worker on wage labor for survival. Labor under capitalism is thus alienated. The worker does not control what they produce, does not determine the conditions of their work, and cannot claim the full product of their effort. This alienation extends beyond the material to the psychological and social. The worker is estranged from their own creativity, from the satisfaction of seeing their work bear fruit for themselves and their community, and from the collective potential of labor as a source of shared prosperity. The capitalist class benefits not merely from the output of labor, but from this alienation itself, for it enforces the distinction between creator and owner, between those who produce and those who command, and ensures that the conditions of production reinforce the power imbalance. The accumulation of wealth by the few, therefore, is directly dependent on the dispossession of the many from the value they create, and the perpetuation of inequality rests on this continuous extraction. Labor produces the necessities and luxuries of life, builds infrastructure, powers industry, advances knowledge, and sustains the very society in which capitalists live in comfort. Yet the workers' access to these benefits is restricted, mediated through wages that are inadequate to capture the full value of what they have produced. Education, healthcare, housing and culture, the products of social labor, become commodities in the market, further restricting the workers' ability to directly enjoy the fruits of their labor while reinforcing dependence on the system. In this sense, capitalism institutionalizes a paradox. Society's collective productivity grows, technological capacities expand, and wealth increases. Yet the workers who generate all of this remain structurally excluded from the benefits. Ownership, not effort, determines access to wealth, and labor, despite being the source of all value, is systematically denied claim to its own creations. This reality underscores the central critique of the capitalist system, that the concentration of wealth and power is maintained not through merit or innovation, but through the continuous expropriation of labor, making the working class both the engine of prosperity and the excluded from it, ensuring that the wealth created collectively is accumulated privately and that the laborer remains, in essence, dispossessed even as they sustain the material basis of society. The unity of workers represents a force that the ruling class has feared for centuries, for it threatens the very foundation upon which their power is built. Power under capitalism depends not only on ownership of the means of production, but also on the division and subjugation of those who labor. When workers are fragmented, pitted against one another by differences of skill, nationality, race, or gender, the system maintains control, exploiting not just their labor, but their inability to act collectively. Capital thrives on this division, using competition, ideology, and social hierarchy to prevent workers from recognizing that their individual struggles are part of a larger shared oppression. It is only when workers awaken to their shared condition, when they recognize that their interests are aligned rather than opposed, that the balance of power begins to shift. Unity transforms the worker from a passive participant into an active agent, capable of challenging the structures that exploit them. Solidarity magnifies the collective power of labor far beyond what any individual could achieve alone, making strikes, labor movements, and social organization effective weapons against systemic exploitation. History provides ample examples of this dynamic. Isolated uprisings are often crushed, but when workers act in concert across industries, regions, or even nations, the ruling class struggles to maintain control. The threat lies not merely in the act of protest or rebellion, but in the consciousness that underpins unity. The realization that exploitation is structural, that oppression is systemic, and that collective action can alter the distribution of wealth and power. Unit Y undermines the ideological frameworks that maintain control by exposing the contradictions of capitalism, revealing that the wealth of the few exists only because of the labor of the many. It dismantles the illusion that the worker's success depends on individual merit rather than collective exploitation, and it challenges the social narratives that justify inequality. When workers unite, they become not just a labor force, but a political and economic actor, with the ability to enforce change, to negotiate terms of labor, and to assert rights over the conditions of production. This is precisely why ruling powers invest so heavily in maintaining division. They understand that a fragmented workforce is compliant, easily manipulated, and unlikely to challenge ownership, profit, or social hierarchy. Division can take many forms, from institutionalized discrimination and differential wages to ideological indoctrination and cultural narratives that instill competition rather than cooperation. Even within labor movements, attempts at unity are often undermined by rivalries, suspicion, or co-optation, illustrating how threatened ruling powers are by cohesive organization. Solidarity requires not just coordination of action but alignment of consciousness, the recognition that the liberation of one worker is tied to the liberation of all, and that social transformation is impossible without collective struggle. When this awareness spreads, it shifts the perception of power. Workers begin to understand that the structures of capitalism rely entirely on their compliance and labor, and that without their participation, wealth production grinds to a halt. This realization is dangerous for those who benefit from inequality, for it exposes the dependency of ruling classes on the very people they seek to control. The unity of workers also transcends immediate economic concerns, challenging political authority, social norms, and cultural hierarchies. It becomes a vehicle for broader transformation, as coordinated labor movements often intersect with demands for justice, equality, and representation. Solidarity allows workers to assert collective bargaining power, to resist exploitation, and to create alternative institutions and networks that bypass the mechanisms of the ruling class, demonstrating the capacity for society to function under different principles. The fear of worker unity is thus existential for those in power because it threatens the legitimacy of their authority and the profitability of their enterprises. It turns the logic of dependence on its head, showing that the many have the power to reshape society and redistribute resources if they act in concert. Even small acts of coordination, communication, and mutual support among workers carry the potential to escalate into movements that challenge systemic exploitation and force concessions that benefit the collective rather than the elite few. Unity transforms vulnerability into strength, turning the dispersed energy of isolated individuals into a coherent force capable of negotiating, resisting, and creating change. It disrupts the mechanisms of control that rely on division, rendering ideologies of competition, meritocracy, and hierarchy ineffective, and it empowers workers to claim agency over their labor, their communities, and ultimately the conditions of their lives. When workers achieve unity, they become not merely participants in the economy, but shapers of society, capable of redefining power itself, demanding accountability, and challenging the legitimacy of those who profit from their oppression, thereby altering the balance of social, political, and economic forces in a way that threatens the entrenched order and compels the ruling class to confront the latent power of collective labor. Social transformation is not spontaneous, nor does it occur through individual effort alone. It requires the deliberate and organized struggle of those who recognize their shared conditions and common interests. Society is structured by systems of power and inequality that are maintained through laws, institutions, culture, and ideology, all designed to preserve the dominance of a privileged class and to perpetuate the subordination of the majority. These systems are resilient, adaptive, and deeply entrenched, and they cannot be dismantled through isolated acts of rebellion or passive discontent. Organized collective struggle is the means by which the oppressed assert their power, confront systemic exploitation, and create the conditions for meaningful change. Such struggle begins with consciousness, the recognition that personal suffering is not the result of individual failure, but of structural oppression, and that solutions require cooperation rather than isolated action. Consciousness alone, however, is insufficient. It must be transformed into coordinated action, strategy, and discipline. The working class, when unified, becomes capable of resisting not only the immediate manifestations of inequality, but also the underlying structures that reproduce it. Organized struggle takes many forms, including strikes, protests, political movements, cooperative institutions, mutual aid networks, and labor unions, all of which channel collective energy into directed efforts that challenge the existing order. These efforts are effective precisely because they harness the social, economic, and moral power of the majority, making visible the capacity of ordinary people to shape our own conditions, rather than passively accepting the dictates of the powerful. Social transformation, through organized struggle, is inherently relational. It depends on the bonds formed between individuals who recognize their common interests and the necessity of solidarity. Without coordination, the efforts of individuals are fragmented, easily suppressed or co-opted, but when organized, they multiply in effectiveness, creating pressure that cannot be ignored. The ruling class understands this dynamic, which is why division, distraction, and ideological manipulation are consistently employed to prevent unity and to maintain control. Overcoming these divisions requires intentionality, communication, shared goals, mutual education, and the creation of networks that connect workers across industries, communities, and regions. Organized struggle also demands strategy, as action without planning can lead to failure, co-optation, or repression. It requires a clear understanding of the conditions of power, the levers of influence, and the mechanisms by which systemic oppression is maintained. Education, both formal and informal, becomes a tool for empowerment, equipping participants with knowledge of history, economics, and social dynamics, and fostering the capacity to anticipate and respond to countermeasures deployed by those in power. Collective struggle transforms individual frustration into a coherent force capable of challenging entrenched hierarchies, negotiating rights, and asserting agency over the means of production, distribution, and governance. Social transformation is therefore inseparable from organization, as the structures that perpetuate inequality are themselves. LV is organized, interconnected, and resilient. The process of organizing cultivates leadership, discipline, and accountability, ensuring that collective action is sustained, adaptable, and effective. It also creates spaces for dialogue, mutual support, and the development of shared vision, reinforcing solidarity and clarifying the objectives of struggle. Furthermore, organized collective struggle embodies both defensive and offensive dimensions. It resists exploitation, oppression, and marginalization, while simultaneously constructing alternative institutions, practices, and relationships that prefigure a different social order. This duality underscores the transformative potential of collective action. It addresses immediate injustices while laying the groundwork for systemic change. Social transformation cannot be delegated to the benevolence of the ruling class, for their interests are antithetical to equity. It cannot be achieved through isolated acts of moral conscience, because structural power responds to organization, not sentiment. Only through deliberate coordination, sustained effort, and mutual accountability can the oppressed assert their collective power to reshape society in accordance with justice, equality, and human dignity. Historical movements provide evidence of this principle, demonstrating that when the masses act in concert, they can compel concessions, alter laws, redistribute resources, and even overturn entrenched systems of power. Without organization, however, even widespread dissatisfaction remains diffuse, ephemeral, and easily suppressed, leaving the structures of exploitation intact and allowing the ruling class to maintain dominance. Organized struggle, therefore, is both the method and the foundation of social transformation, linking consciousness with action, individual experience with collective reality, and moral urgency with practical efficacy. It transforms the potential of the many into tangible results, ensuring that grievances are not only expressed but translated into sustained effort capable of producing lasting change. It demands courage, persistence, and vision, cultivating the capacity of ordinary people to recognize their collective power and to deploy it effectively against the mechanisms of oppression, creating conditions under which a new social order can emerge, defined not by the accumulation of wealth for the few, but by the equitable distribution of resources, opportunities, and dignity for all, and establishing a society in which human potential is no longer subordinated to the imperatives of profit, hierarchy, and exploitation. The most powerful revolutions begin without noise is a call to awaken, unite, and act. It reveals that the structures of exploitation, division, and alienation under capitalism are not natural but imposed, and that the power to change society resides in the hands of those who produce its wealth. True revolution begins not with spectacle, but with consciousness, the recognition of shared oppression, the understanding of systemic exploitation, and the refusal to accept inequality as inevitable. It emphasizes that labor is the source of all value, that the worker is dispossessed of the wealth they create, and that unity among workers is the most formidable threat to the ruling class. Social transformation, the speech reminds us, is not achieved through isolated efforts or passive discontent, but through organized, disciplined, and collective struggle, where solidarity becomes both a shield and a weapon. The speech exhorts the oppressed to see themselves not as powerless individuals, but as a collective force capable of reshaping society, reclaiming their rights, and constructing a new order in which wealth serves human need, not private accumulation. It is a revolutionary manifesto for awareness, unity, and action, underscoring that the quiet stirrings of consciousness are the prelude to the most powerful upheavals in history.